Last week, we heard about this man, born in 1813 in Scotland to a poor family, working in a cotton mill as he grew up. Started working in a cotton mill when he was 10 years old, but he knew about the Lord Jesus. And he knew, he was taught from he was very young, that God could transform your life. And God did transform this man's life. Whenever he was only 12, he asked the Lord Jesus into his life, and that made him part of God's family. But then God was going to use this man. You see, God not only saves us and takes away our sin, but then God changes us and makes us more like the Lord Jesus, and then he can use us in his service as well. This man wanted to serve God. Remember, God had helped him. He believed that God had wanted him to be a doctor, and God helped him study. And finally, after many years of study, he qualified to be a doctor. But it didn't stop there. He had prayed that prayer, Lord, what would you want me to do with my life? Where do you want me to go? Where do you want me to serve you? And he believed that God had put on his heart the continent of Africa, to go to Africa as a missionary doctor, to help people and to tell many people that God could transform their lives as well through putting their trust in the Lord Jesus. David Livingstone wanted to serve God. Young people, look how God had transformed this man's life. God had taken him now, he had helped him to become a doctor, and now he was heading off to Africa to be a missionary doctor. Young people, God can transform your life as well. God can take you and God can change you and God can use you in his service to tell many, many people about the Lord Jesus. Finally, after many years of preparation and study, 1840, and David Livingstone stepped off the shores of England onto a steamboat, and he started to go down around the coast of England and down right down towards the coast of Africa. And finally, in 1840, 8th of December, he stepped off that steamboat onto the continent of Africa. Now, he went to a mission station. Again, he had to prepare. He couldn't just get off a coast and walk up into some tribes. For a start, he couldn't speak the languages. So what he had to start to do was, if he wanted to go into a tribe, he had to start to learn enough of the language so that he could communicate to those people. And he said himself that it took him 6 months to learn enough of the language to be able to communicate with the people in the tribes. And then if you moved on to another tribe, you had to learn the dialect and had to learn how they spoke as well, or their language as well. But God was helping him every step of the way. People, look how God can use ordinary people. God took David Livingstone from a poor family in Scotland, and now here he was as a doctor and a missionary in the continent of Africa. Young person, God uses people just like you and just like me, ordinary people. Maybe God will not ask you to go to maybe like the continent of Africa or to go away as a missionary, but maybe you are a Christian. But we know what he does ask you. He asks you to live for him just where you are. Maybe among your family, maybe among your friends. I wonder, do your friends know that you're a Christian? God maybe will put it on your heart to go maybe tell your friends. Yes, God can transform your life as well when you put your trust in the Lord Jesus. David Livingstone, he was so busy. He concentrated in Central Africa. If you look at the yellow shaded areas, now remember, Africa is vast. And David Livingstone, he was the first European to go to the bottom shaded area. He was the first European to go from one side of Africa right across to the other. And remember, in those days, there weren't really roads or cars or trains or anything like that to be able to take you from one side to the other. He'd have had to hack his way through a forest from tribe to tribe to get from one side to the other. And he made many wonderful discoveries. Remember, he was a missionary, he was a doctor, but he's also a pioneer and a discoverer as well. And he discovered also the source of the Zambezi River, which was a big thing. They wanted to know where the source of the Zambezi River was, and he found it. And also the illness that was so dangerous in those days was a thing called malaria. And David Livingstone discovered treatment for malaria. And that's why for the next 30 years, he could spend his time in Africa and serve the Lord there because he had this treatment for malaria. Because usually a missionary, whenever they went to Africa in those days, maybe only lasted maybe 1 or 2 years because of that awful illness. David Livingstone was there for 30 years. But remember, who was helping him? God was helping him. But he was just an ordinary person. And that's what I want you to remember, is that God uses ordinary people just like you and just like me to serve him. And God was using David Livingstone. Young person, maybe you think to yourself, well, what can I do for God? Well, you can serve God just where you are. And you can tell people about the Lord Jesus just where you are, just where you are. You can start with your friends and you start with your family. And God uses ordinary people just like you and just like me. Once you've put your trust in the Lord Jesus, then God can use you to tell others that God, the Lord Jesus, can transform their lives as well. David Livingstone made many amazing discoveries. This was one of the discoveries that he made. He's the first European ever to see this waterfall. Now, this is the largest waterfall in the world. Does anyone know its name? It starts with V, and he named it after the then Queen. Oh, I can hear you all calling out. It's Queen Victoria, and of course, it's Victoria Falls. He was the first European ever to see Victoria Falls. Look at all the amazing discoveries that David Livingstone was making. God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. But it wasn't always easy for David Livingstone. He said himself that there was one day and they were heading through the forest, and all of a sudden they heard this roar from behind some trees, and a lion jumped out and attacked David Livingstone. It jumped onto him and it sunk its teeth into his shoulder. It was looking for lunch, and it didn't care who David Livingstone was. And the men that were with David Livingstone, they ran over and they had clubs and the guns. They shot the guns in the air and they had clubs and they beat the lion off. But David Livingstone was badly injured. And the people thought, well, this is him now. He was taken back to the mission station to recover. And people thought, look, he's older now, he's injured, he'll just go back to Scotland and he'll just live out the rest of his days in Scotland, a bit of comfort just as a doctor. But no, David Livingstone knew that God had called him to Africa, and that's where he stayed. He waited till he recovered, and then he carried on, going from tribe to tribe, helping people and telling people how God can transform lives. You see, he knew this. Maybe you're listening to this today and maybe you're going through a difficult time. Maybe it's because of what's happening in the world, the pandemic. Maybe it's because you're at home and you're missing your school friends. Maybe it's your school lessons on Zoom or something. Maybe you're finding that difficult. You're just maybe finding it difficult at home, not being with your friends. Well, I want you to remember this, young person, as a Christian, God gives you a promise. And that promise is, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. David Livingstone could face difficulties. He could face diseases. He could face dangerous tribes. He could face lions, because he knew that God was with him, and God, the Lord Jesus, would never leave him, would never forsake him. Remember, God was helping David Livingstone every step of the way, and he'll do the same for you, young person. You choose to live for God, put your trust in the Lord Jesus, and then ask the Lord, what do you want me to do? God promises that he will help you every step of the way. David Livingstone never gave up. He never gave in. There's one morning, and the men noticed that David Livingstone hadn't come down for breakfast. And I can just imagine them going over to the door and knocking the door and no answer. So they opened the door, and there was David Livingstone kneeling by his bedside. But David Livingstone, as he prayed, the heart that loved Africa so much had stopped beating. David Livingstone died in Africa on his knees, praying for the people of Africa, talking to the Lord Jesus. And I think that's amazing. Just imagine what that was like. He was on his knees, one moment on his knees, with his Bible open, praying and talking to the Lord Jesus. Then the heart that loved Africa so much stopped beating. And all of a sudden, he was face to face in heaven with the Lord Jesus. You see, David Livingstone knew because he had put his trust in the Lord Jesus, he was going to go to heaven one day. It wasn't because he was a missionary. It wasn't because he was helping thousands of people. It wasn't because he was making all these wonderful discoveries. It was because he put his trust in the Lord Jesus and asked the Lord Jesus into his life when he was only 12 years old. And that's why David Livingstone is in heaven today. I'm looking forward to meeting David Livingstone because I put my trust in the Lord Jesus whenever I was 22, 35 years ago, and that tells you what age I am. But I'm looking forward to going to heaven, not because I'm a good person, but because I've put my trust in the Lord Jesus. And I'm going to meet David Livingstone one day, and I'm going to tell him, I told your story, and boys and girls listen to it, and adults too, hopefully listen to it online, and they heard your story. But it would even be nicer that if you were there in heaven and you come over to me and David Livingstone instead and told us, I heard your story one day. And because I heard your story, I put my trust in the Lord Jesus. And that's why I'm here today. Don't put it off. Remember, God changes lives, but he also uses ordinary people just like you and me. But it all starts if you put your trust in the Lord Jesus and ask him into your life. David Livingstone's body was brought back to England, and he was given a hero's burial. And his body is buried in Westminster Abbey. And you can go and visit his burial site even today, Westminster Abbey. But the people of Africa loved David Livingstone so much, they had a request. Do you know what they asked for? They asked, can we have his heart? And the answer came back, yes. And David Livingstone's heart is buried in Africa, and his body is buried in Westminster Abbey in England, in London. But the heart that loved Africa so much is still there in Africa. You know, David Livingstone made many discoveries, but the greatest discovery he ever made was that the Lord Jesus loved him, the Lord Jesus died for him, and he put his trust in the Lord Jesus at 12 years old, and that's what changed this man's life. You know, there's statues built to this man, David Livingstone, and here's one, and this one is on the bank of Victoria Falls. And then below there's a plaque, and it tells about the Lord, about how he served the Lord Jesus for 30 years and loved the people of Africa so much. And I love that there's statues to David Livingstone because you know David Livingstone had a brother, and his brother's name was John. But John didn't love the Lord Jesus. He didn't put his trust in God. John went to Canada, and he made up his mind that he wanted to be wealthy, and he spent all his life making money. At the end of his life, he died one of the most wealthy men in Canada, but he never trusted the Lord Jesus. You know, David Livingstone has statues made of him. There's stories being told. Here's me telling you the story now of David Livingstone, all because God had transformed his life and he put his trust in the Lord Jesus. And now we're telling his story. Young person, I wonder, what about you? I wonder, will you be like David Livingstone, who lived to please God and is in heaven today? Or will you be like his brother John Livingstone, who went to Canada, just lived to make money, but he isn't in heaven today? I hope you're wise, and I hope you will realize that the Lord Jesus can use ordinary people just like you and just like me, and that you'll put your trust in the Lord Jesus today. Ask him into your life, and maybe someday somebody will be sitting here telling your story. Thank you for listening.